On an annual basis, Canada has exported $19.6 billion more to the U.S. in 1992 than they did when the NDP opposed the treaty. In March of 1993, our exports to the United States were 21% ahead of in March of 1992. Our trade surplus with the United States reached $17.7 billion in 1992.
Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister speaks about the fact that the economy is growing and increasing, but he ignores the figures that 1.5 million Canadians are still out of work, 2.6 million Canadians are collecting social assistance, and 4.2 million Canadians are living under the poverty line. The facts are clear, Madam Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, and to think that I rushed all the way back from hunting in Russia for this.
The proposals in NAFTA will alter the way of life of all Canadians, and using the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement as a guide, NAFTA's implementation will have a negative impact on Canada. Mr. Speaker, in my riding of Stormont-Dundas, I have seen what the Conservative government's version of free trade means for Canada. High unemployment, plant closures, an exodus southward of Canadian businesses owned by foreign parent companies, and a Canadian economy near ruin.
NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It will eventually eliminate most trade barriers among Mexico, Canada, and the United States. The deal creates a North American trading bloc. Similar blocs are already forming in Europe and Asia. Canada has been implementing freer trade with the U.S. since 1989. Mexico has also had a form of free trade with the U.S. for more than 25 years. NAFTA reinforces these agreements and, in fact, widens their scope. The new bloc encompasses 360 million people, the largest free trade bloc in the world. It will powerfully affect the lives of millions. Canada's economy has changed since 1989. Since the Free Trade Agreement, the FTA, came into effect, almost 500,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost. Critics blame the FTA. Free trade supporters argue that recession is to blame. They quote rising exports to the U.S. as proof that the deal is a success.
We started encouraging the idea of a free trade agreement with the United States in the early 1980s, and it meant taking the free trade issue to governments of all stripes and building a case for it.
I think that the U.S. has always reacted depending on his own problems. If they have a current account deficit, then they'll be protectionist. Otherwise, they'll be free trade promoters.
Comme je vous l'ai dit, le libre-échange, ce n'est pas un système dans lequel tout le monde gagne. Ça, c'est un mythe de la théorie commerciale qu'il va falloir oublier. C'est un système où il y a des perdants, des gagnants, des secteurs en expansion, des secteurs en récession.
Well, I think overall the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement has worked well. I'm of the view that the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement makes the case for going forward with more free trade initiatives rather than fewer.
A conservative doctrine, if you will, which is I would put in the best terms I could as a laissez-faire attitude, that the market will look after all of us. Well, in fact, the government is much more than that.
And let's keep in mind that in the early 1980s, before we had a free trade agreement, we had higher levels of unemployment and more plant shutdowns than we've had in the 1991-1993 period. And we didn't have free trade to blame it on then.
There's nothing that ties production and jobs in Canada to access to our market.
Well, I think it worked well. If one looks at the hard facts today in 1993, we are running record trade surpluses on the merchandise trade account with the United States.
The merchandise trade surplus with the United States has risen since the deal, but according to the Business Council on National Issues, it's still around the same as it was in 1986, before the FTA. If trade in services, like interest on investments, are included, Canada has a trade deficit.
In fact, you can see a period over the last 20 years where trade has doubled and the standard of living has gone down. And I'm for citizens of the United States and Mexico both, and Canada.
Cornwall is a town on the Canadian side of the United States border. It lies between Ottawa and Montreal. 46,000 people live here. The St. Lawrence Seaway came through here in the 1950s. It brought jobs. Factories set up shop on the waterfront. Back then, people expected to work in a factory when they got out of school. Things have changed. Cornwall has been hit hard by recent events, although there is some argument as to what hit it. Some blame recession, others the FTA. Either way, the result is 22% unemployment. 2,840 people have lost their jobs since 1989.
200 or 300 were actually layoffs, if you will. The others were permanent job losses through plant closure. And those plant closures, most of them have relocated to the United States to continue operation.
Donc il y a eu un impact dévastateur quand même sur le secteur manufacturier. Est-ce que c'est vraiment le résultat du libre-échange? Évidemment, c'est une question qu'il faut aborder avec beaucoup de souplesse, car il y a tout un phénomène de restructuration déjà qui s'opère à l'échelle mondiale. Et ce secteur manufacturier est en baisse, de toute façon, de ce point de vue global aussi.
It's the same kind of problems that we are seeing all over the world. It's a product of economies slowing down. It's a product of global restructuring. It's a product of some of the excesses of the 1980s. And so for all of those reasons, we are seeing plants shutting down.
240 people used to work in this Cornwall's films plant. In 1989, it stopped making cellophane and laid everyone off. One of the people who lost her job here was Fran Seguin. Fran was a data processor with Cornwall's for 23 years.
Unless you go through it, you can't imagine. Like, it's not only the money part coming in. Mind you, that has a lot to do with it. You can't live without the money. But it's not only the money part that will affect you. It's everything put together. It affects you. And it's a state of mind. But I think they're hurting a lot of people.
Fran blames free trade for her loss.
We could see some of our orders going to the States, being bought in the States. And eventually, some of our products were being cut in the States. It was cheaper to get it done in the States.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our wedding table.
Now Fran works part-time nights selling bingo cards and part-time days as a school lunch monitor. Fran is underemployed.
There's no security. Once you start looking for a job, what is there? There's part-time. Part-time don't have any benefits for you.
Fran and her former co-workers work part-time, but part-time workers who really want to be full-time are underemployed. They aren't counted in unemployment statistics. The government only counts those who are looking for work. Some sociologists say this means real unemployment is double the official figure, not 1.5 million, but 3 million. Workers in Cornwall are nearly dependent on just one company. That's Domtar. It owns many businesses in town, among them the big paper mill, that employs about 1,000 people.
We are by far the biggest employer in Cornwall. I think we're 3 or 4 times larger than anybody else. And really, Domtar is Cornwall, and Cornwall is Domtar.
Domtar has been in Cornwall since the turn of the century. In recent years, Domtar Inc. has been restructuring. Since the FTA, it's laid off about 3,500 people, 226 in Cornwall. It's trying to become competitive with American companies. Domtar says it's made the cuts without reducing its capacity to produce.
What we're going to be doing is making sure that the collectivity of the Cornwall mill is going to be around. And we're trying to secure the future of the 1,150 jobs that we have here at the present time.
Diesel Recon once had a factory in Cornwall. It reconditioned engines for Cummins Diesel of Canada. The building it used has been taken over by other business. Cummins closed the plant after its workers trained Mexican technicians.
It just seems kind of ironic that, you know, 5 or 6 key people from ORAS would come up here, learn our technology, and then go back there, apply it, find out that it works, and then have the place closed down. To me, I think it's black and white.
We all know only too well that that plant has since been closed, and in fact that production has been moved to Mexico. And so there in itself, if you will, Cornwall people have already experienced the possible effects of NAFTA.
Mexico, once ruled by Aztecs and Maya. Today, it has over 82 million Amerindians, Spanish, and Mestizo, a mix of the other two bloodlines. Canada exports just over $500 million in goods to Mexico. Mexico sends $2.8 billion worth of goods back to Canada. Because of a debt crisis in 1981, the country had to cut the budget, increase taxes, lower wages, and privatize national industries. Today, there are 40 million Mexicans living under the poverty line, nearly half the population. But North American business wants people to see them as a huge potential market for Canadian and U.S. goods.
Mexico loves American products, and right now I don't know of any country that you can really find that would be willing to say that they love American products. You know, you bring a Ford down there, they'll gobble it up. They love American cars, they love American clothing.
The result is that today they've taken their inflation rate, which was skyrocketing, down to single digits. They have a better debt position than Canada has. They've got their overall debt situation as a percentage of their GDP under control. They are privatizing. They are creating new jobs and new industries and attracting literally billions of dollars of investment.
That is the business viewpoint, but as in Canada, there are critics who point to the human cost of Mexico's economic upheaval. Real wages have dropped 50% in the 80s, according to some.
We have seen the destruction of all the democratic and independent unions that we used to have during the 80s. We have seen the disappearance of health workers union, of university workers union, of telephone democratic tendencies.
The main labor organizations are controlled by corrupt leaderships. They are willing to sell contracts, they are willing to sell strikes. And a few days ago, they killed the leader of the president of the railroad union because corruption, because money laundering, because many things.
When you do that and you go through that degree of profound change, people and industries are going to have to accept sacrifices.
Tijuana is the largest city in the border state of Baja California, also the fastest growing. It has 2 million people, and the border to the United States is the busiest crossing point in the world. It could be said that Tijuana is booming. But shantytowns smear the landscape. The factories provide jobs, but most of the population still lives in squalor. 60,000 people are employed in maquiladoras, specially regulated assembly plants. There are 492 of them in Tijuana, and new ones open weekly here. In 1964, the United States ended the Brocaro program, which allowed 200,000 Mexican farm workers to work in the U.S. each year. Mexico had to find a new way to create jobs and industries. So, it created the maquiladora system. Today, there are 500,000 workers employed in nearly 2,000 maquila plants. Most are U.S. owned. They import American parts, assemble them with cheap Mexican labor, and ship out the finished product virtually tax-free. The Mexican government hoped that by creating this free trade zone, it could encourage American manufacturers to set up in Mexico, buying parts and supplies locally.
For Mexico, it has provided basically an area for these people to go to work, to be able to raise their standard of living. And what it's done for the United States is actually more important, because now these people who are gaining a decent wage, for every dollar that they earn, 15 cents of that goes to buy American products.
Well, they have created jobs. Many of these people, if they weren't working in the maquiladoras, where would they be? What would they be doing? I definitely think so. Many of the people, these Mexicans, are very happy to have these jobs that they have right now at the maquiladoras.
But according to sources like the United States Department of Labor and the Conference Board of Canada, only 4% of a product's cost actually goes into the Mexican economy, mostly on wages and operating costs. The rest of the money stays in the company's home country.
There are few areas or few sectors who are benefited. Those who own the buildings, those who own the land where they work, those who own the transportation companies. Those are the ones who become millionaires.
The Sanyo plant, which had the most state-of-the-art technologies for producing televisions, didn't have the most basic health and safety technologies.
The maquiladora program, set up about 20 years ago, was one of those things which represented a good intention, failing the consideration of things that are fairly fundamental, like the environment.
That problem was there a long time ago, and way before even the maquilas were there. So I don't think you can blame any of those type of problems on a free trade agreement or a maquila program. I think the problems were there. I mean, you look at the river, and it was polluted to begin with.
These kind of investments and this kind of profits, this kind of mechanisms, the only thing they do is perpetuate poverty among our workers.
Most of the maquiladoras are completely linked, I mean, depending on the evolution of the U.S. economy.
Some say companies only move to Mexico to take advantage of the lower costs, like labor. Estimates vary wildly, depending on the source, but the Conference Board of Canada estimates typical costs of under $8 a day per worker, lower than Brazil, South Korea, Taiwan, or Singapore.
What you have to consider when you're locating a business is all of the factors that relate to your bottom line. You've got to consider, yes, tariff barriers. You've got to consider wages. You've got to consider the cost of your transportation system, the health care benefits, whether you're going to have employee turnover.
One study that I'm familiar with, looking at a Ford plant in Hermosillo, by moving to Mexico, they're saving about $130 million a year in wage costs. Now, it's true, there are a lot of other costs involved in producing an automobile, but to suggest that $130 or $40 million a year is not a significant amount of money is pretty silly. That's real change.
There is more to the maquila system than economics. The turnover rate for workers can reach 180% a year. This is blamed on laziness, disloyalty, or lack of commitment. But a more reasonable explanation might lie in the working conditions.
160 y un bono de 25. Es casada, una niña y pues la verdad suficiente no.
We found General Motors operating a plant in Matamoros where they were dumping methylene chloride, a carcinogen, at levels 215,000 times what would be permissible under U.S. standards. Or Stepan Chemical that was dumping a chemical called xylene at levels 52,000 times U.S. standards. I mean, the numbers are astronomical.
I went down to Mexico to the maquiladoras. There's evidence of toxic waste dumping, and they've been trying to grow grass for 2 years.
These are jobs, but these are not the best.
Chemical spills, chemical releases into their plants where workers have been overcome by toxic fumes.
Toxic waste that children are playing in, women are washing clothes in.
Spontaneous abortions, women who haven't been allowed to leave their shift because they're in labor or because they're miscarrying.
There's a lot of sexual harassment.
We're seeing a lot of injuries and deaths in maquilas.
People work with lead with their bare hands.
This boy was completely unsupervised. He got caught on the conveyor, was pulled into the crusher, and was killed.
Children are being born with brain, damage and only half a brain or no brain at all.
Ford paid the boy's family $2,300 for the loss of their son.
It cost 2.5 months' salary to get running water installed here this year. The Sanction Gomez family lives in 4 rooms in a working-class colonia, or neighborhood. 11 people live here, 6 sisters, 3 brothers, and their parents. Jose Jesus Sanction Gomez is 20. He's worked in 3 maquiladoras in the last 4 years.
Trabajo en maquiladora, operador de una máquina. Por el momento, ¿no?
Peligroso.
Algo. Como el departamento de barniz.
Barniz.
Sí. Thinner.
They use thinner, en área you use thinner.
Laca.
Laca.
Para hacer algo. Transcurso de meses.
Puede que peligroso.
¿Peligroso?
Sí, porque cuando llueve las fábricas usan mucha química. Los niños les traen ponches en la piel.
Ah.
No, es más chiquito.
Accidentado.
Bueno, accidente a una compañía de trabajo. Una prensa se voló un pedazo de su dedo. Se puede prensar.
¿Sí?
Bueno, pues no siente nada porque estoy acostumbrado a un poco a eso.
Most arguments about NAFTA center on labor and the environment. So, this August, after the deal had already passed in the Canadian House of Commons, new deals were created. These side agreements set out penalties for countries that fail to enforce their labor and environmental laws. Penalties include trade sanctions and fines.
Poverty is the environment's worst enemy. And with this increase in commerce, this is going to create tax revenues, and this is going to be where this growth is going to come from to protect the environment.
I think it will make it much easier to enforce because it brings to bear one thing that is of particular importance, and that is it makes it possible to put a television camera, the limelight, on the issue.
NAFTA has already brought these issues into the spotlight, and that in itself is very positive, but that doesn't mean we should pass NAFTA. NAFTA is a lousy agreement that should be defeated. On the other hand, we should negotiate a good trade agreement with Mexico.
NAFTA sets up dispute resolution panels, which will decide if action is to be taken against any country. As other Latin American countries join the trading bloc, Canada will have less control over these panels. Each member country also defines which group has the right to press a complaint.
But again, one has to determine that the government's failure to enforce the laws is unjustified and has occurred over a repeated period of time, and it's just not clear to me, for example, what a justifiable failure to enforce your labor laws would be.
What it's all about in these side agreements is cooperation agreements. The standards are domestic standards, and they will still apply the domestic standards. It will not be any changes in the domestic law, not the U.S., not the Canadians, and not the Mexicans. It's a cooperation agreement in environment, and the other one in labor.
The question is it good enough? And is it better than nothing? As long as it forces the environmental standards of these countries backward, we think it's worse than nothing. NAFTA, from an environmental point of view, creates a situation that's far better than the alternative, which is no NAFTA.
The pollution and the pain that's caused to people now by corporations, that kind of pain, that kind of exploitation cannot continue for any amount of time, be it 1 year, 2 years, however long it takes for people to say, for panels to discuss the issues.
There is another major worry for those who oppose NAFTA. They fear lower wages and safety rules will attract corporations to move jobs from Canada and the U.S. to Mexico, and that Mexico will become a haven for the exploitation of workers. But free trade supporters say that this is the opposite of what will happen.
I'm going to be supporting NAFTA. I believe that it's going to create more high-skill, high-wage jobs for Americans through exports.
The problem with free trade is that the lag time from now between right now we have the tariffs. We let those tariffs go, and the time frame, let's say that's 10 years, until all the competition, until the people that lose their jobs, they move to a different industry and they become competitive again. At the end, it will be much more efficient and it will be competitive and it will be ultimately be cheaper for the consumer.
Whenever you open the economy and leave the foreign production to enter into the Mexican market, what we should see will be a lot of job destruction.
They say at the beginning that they will help Mexico educating technicians. That was a lie from these big companies.
To put the ultimate argument to the critics who say that all of these jobs are going to be sucked off down into the Mexican economy, the question I put to them, why is it that all the poor, low-paid economies around the world have not sucked away all of the jobs from the industrialized world in the last 20 years?
I've heard of some strange numbers coming out saying 50 cents an hour. Some of them are making, $5 a day. I'd like to find some of those companies because if I can find them, I'd like to utilize that labor. That doesn't exist.
Certain industries, of course, have been leaving and will leave regardless of NAFTA if it passes or not. And those are high labor-intensive jobs because it is to their comparative advantage in Mexico.
I don't think that we should be able to look and just let the corporations go down to another country, to another people, and exploit them in a way that we just wouldn't accept. There's no way Canadians would accept the kind of working conditions, the kind of living conditions that Mexican people are living in now.
So that's what Canadians should be worrying about, the creation of the new jobs, of the new economy, not worrying about some of the jobs that won't be around in Canada anyway 10 to 15 years from now.
The labor courts did not acknowledge any international labor standards. They do not address workers' right to organize, workers' right to strike, workers' right to collectively bargain.
We know that what they've done in Europe is that they have not set up a free trade zone. They've set up a political community with a desire to bring everybody up to the higher common standards. What you're doing is setting up under NAFTA and the first agreement is a lowest common denominator, weakest to the wall, survival of the fittest, win or die regime. This is a win-win-win for the corporations of the three countries and a lose-lose-lose for the people.
Some say a prosperous future depends on trade agreements like NAFTA that help Canadians compete by binding countries together. Others fear that such economic agreements will become more powerful than the democratic governments that create them.
Why is the NAFTA good for us? It's because we'll get a level playing field. We'll be able to export goods into Mexico on a basis which is much more akin to what Mexico does with Canada today. That's what the value of the NAFTA agreement is about.
We want to continue to improve relations, obviously with the United States, our biggest exporting trading partner, but also with other Western Hemisphere countries, and also with the Pacific Rim and Europe. There are tremendous opportunities around the globe, and I think it would not be in the best interest of Canada and Canadian workers to limit ourselves to just one large trading partner like the United States.
I think it's going to be very bad for both the Mexican and the American people, North American people. I think we're going to lose, the ones that are going to suffer the most in the United States are the small business people.
I think it's not a project for the workers. It's not a project for the weak countries, for Canadians or Mexicans. It's a project of the U.S. to recover competitive and hegemonic powers in the world economy.
It's terribly important for Canadian exports, for Canadian investment, that we be there and that we not sit up in the cold north twiddling our thumbs while Americans and Japanese and Germans and French and others go to Mexico.
So they are offering that Mexico is going to be the winner, but maybe in the very long term, which it is to say maybe in 20 years, 25 years, and at that time the country will probably have had many social explosions before receiving the benefits of NAFTA.
Pour les États-Unis, ce sera un échec politique finalement. Ce sera la démonstration au reste du monde que même à l'intérieur d'un continent nord-américain, on n'arrive pas à développer une politique commerciale.
We're now competing directly against workers in South Carolina, workers in Mexico, eventually workers in Guatemala, without standards built right into the body of the agreement. What in heaven's name would keep our standards from going down? Why would we harmonize upward? That's not the goal of this thing. If that were the goal of this thing, those standards would have been built into the agreement. We wouldn't be having these fights about it.
There is a massive transfer of power taking place under these free trade agreements. The NAFTA amounts to a huge power grab. It will transfer power out of the hands of democratically elected governments and into the hands of transnational corporations and banks.
Well, I believe that businessmen, I believe would do a better job if everything was controlled by the government. It would just go to their special interests, and I believe in free trade, that under the businessmen, it will ultimately be more competitive and more efficient.
NAFTA is already in effect. It is slowly dismantling trade barriers within North America. Eventually, most goods and jobs will move freely, although workers won't. And critical questions still remain. Canadians still can't agree whether free trade has done more harm than good. Will the new trade agreement make things worse? And will it be any help to those who've already lost their jobs? The 40 million Mexicans living in poverty have little hope right now for a better future. But who will benefit from NAFTA? And will it be any different from the Maquiladora program?
Well, because maybe you will make more money in your country than the United States. But if you make more money in the United States than your country, you go to the United States.